Well, good morning, everyone. Um, some of the most intriguing life stories from people who have had to work through adversity and persecution and yet overcame it are ones that are part of our history. And we know that there have been many successful people who overcame personal challenges. I think of Ben Franklin, who dropped out of school when he was 10, and a majority of the U.S. presidents for the first 50 years, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, lost their fathers very early in life. Even Albert Einstein didn't speak until he was 4 years old. And of course, Edison's famous quote, he said, "I have not failed, but I found 10,000 ways that won't work," as he pursued the light bulb. It made me think also about people who are overcoming cultural adversity. Others fight to bring dignity and equality to broken cultures. I think of Maggie Gobran, a Coptic Christian in Egypt who is living right now. She was born into a wealthy family, but was still the object of intense religious persecution. And so she gave up her academic career at a university in Egypt, where she was teaching computer science, to become the equivalent of what we would know as a Coptic Orthodox nun. And now she works with the poorest children and the persecuted in Cairo's slums. And last year she was awarded the International Woman of Courage Award by the U.S. Department of State and named by the First Lady. Of course, from history, we know William Wilberforce also has a story like that. It's also very inspiring how he overcame the cultural opinions about slavery that he had been born into. And Jesus grabbed a hold of his life, and God's love for every person inspired him to take his faith and his influence to abolish slavery in Great Britain in 1807. Well, certainly Joseph's story, the story that we've been working through these last 4 weeks, is the story of an overcomer. We've read about Joseph, who overcame a family that practiced favoritism, and whose brothers sold him into slavery into a foreign land, and who was unjustly accused of adultery with a boss's wife. And he spent 2 years in prison when he was innocent. And despite all of this, he was being positioned to be the second highest ranking leader in Egypt. Only Pharaoh himself was higher. And last week, that's where we left him. We left him in Egypt, and he's in charge. And he's in charge of storing grain during 7 years of bumper crops and then dispersing it during the following 7 lean years. Yet, in the back of his mind, there is some unfinished business. Though he lives and has a prominent position in Egypt, he's from the family of Israel. He is one of Jacob's sons. And there is a real disconnect and a void and a huge hurt in his heart that comes from the wounds of his brothers that they inflicted upon him early in their life. And so we pick up the story there at the beginning of chapter 42 of Genesis. One day in the middle of the 7-year famine, Joseph's long-lost brothers and father, Jacob, wake up and they don't have any food. And so we pick up in the first 2 verses of chapter 42. It says, "When Jacob heard that the grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, 'Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we'll all die.'" So, as a dad could do, he motivated his sons, and they traveled to Egypt. And irony of all ironies, the brothers find themselves standing before their brother Joseph, asking for food. And Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize Joseph. They don't even suspect that he's alive. And this face-to-face encounter with his brothers, the ones who actually sold him into slavery, reactivates Joseph's long-term unhealed raw memories. And now he has to figure out how to respond. Any of you have a unhealed raw memory that gets activated every now and then? But there comes a time when either your thoughts or even a face-to-face encounter sort of triggers that. And that's the first principle that we see in this last episode of Joseph's life. It's when someone hurts you, you will respond. When someone hurts you, you will respond. The question is, how will you respond? I remember perhaps one of the most extreme cases is an old Carrie Underwood country western song called Before He Cheats, that addresses this subject of responding to hurt. The chorus of the song goes something like this. It goes exactly like this, actually. It says, I dug my key into the side of his pretty little souped-up four-wheel drive. I carved my name into his leather seats. I took a Louisville Slugger to both headlights, and I lashed a hole in all four tires. Maybe he'll think next time before he cheats. Wow. Never thought I'd be saying that from church on a Sunday, but that's a rather extreme way of responding, isn't it? So what goes through your mind when you've been hurt? Pretty much all of us, the first thing that sort of bubbles up is that we crave justice because it's in our wiring. That is when it deals with everybody else but us. In an honest moment, most of us will admit that we know that revenge is not the best way to handle it. On the other hand, we would sure like to get even. It's an internal battle. I've heard it described, revenge is what you do to me, and getting even is what I do to you. When Joseph's brothers felt unjustly hurt by their father's favoritism, they decided to get even by getting rid of Joseph and selling him into slavery. And now it's Joseph's turn. He can get bitter or he can get better, as the old saying goes. And really that's our choice too, isn't it? You and I can get bitter or we can get better. In this case, Joseph was in the driver's seat. He had the power, and the 10 brothers were in a position of weakness. They were hungry. They needed food. And he remembered what it was like looking up from the bottom of the hole in the ground. And so he decides, they need to suffer a little bit of the same thing. So he chooses the bitter route at first. He chooses the revenge route. We pick it up in verses 8 and 9. The writer says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. And he remembered the dreams he'd had about them many years before. He said to them, you are spies. You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become. So, in order to get back at them, he accuses these 10 brothers of being spies, and he puts them in prison, and now they could feel some of his pain. Revenge, it seems so sweet, doesn't it? At least for maybe a short moment. But 3 days later, Joseph realizes, that's not what I should do. Being bitter is eating him up. So Joseph releases them, and all the pain and all the emotion that he had buried for years suddenly surges in him. And the writer tells us in Genesis 42, it says that Joseph, he turned away from them and began to weep. You see, he had suppressed that pain for so long, but it's still there. And seeing his brothers caused that old hurt to sort of percolate up to the surface, didn't it? Unhealed pain is a lot like that. Often comes with rage and depression and despair, or sometimes it just paralyzes us. Did you know that your desire for justice was put there by God? The problem is that we are so bad at doing it ourselves. It's like if you asked, it's like me asking you to extinguish a candle that I'm holding, and you accomplish it with a 5-gallon bucket of water. And our solutions are so overkill. They spill over and drench the person and the others around besides. It happens in marriages and divorces. He hurt me, so I am going to hurt him twice as hard. Or it happens in the marketplace. Someone steals your idea and schmoozes their way up to a promotion that should have been yours, or they just spread lies about you, and retaliation becomes a one-up sort of thing. It even happens in neighborhoods. If my neighbor has inconvenienced me, I'm going to do it back to them even harder. 1 Peter 3:9, Peter writes about this. He says, "Don't return evil for evil, but rather overcome evil with good." Apostle Paul says it too. He says in Romans 12, he says, "Overcome evil with good." When I read those passages from Peter and Paul, I think, well, they didn't know what I was going through. I mean, their situation wasn't nearly as intense as mine. And then I read history and further examine the situation, and I realize actually they did know. In fact, their situation was far worse than I could ever imagine. Remember that Peter and Paul wrote at a time when Christians were being singled out and persecuted and killed at the whim of an evil Roman emperor. Fourth principle that we think about from this passage is that revenge and violence must not be allowed to escalate. With God's help, we must be the ones to be able to say enough and to choose to solve the problems in a different way. We need to trust justice to God. God's really good at that, at just the right time, in just the right intensity and the right way. Chances are we may never actually see it face to face, and that's where the trusting part comes in. So, coming back to our Joseph story, Joseph devises another plan. Before he reveals his identity to his family, he will send them back to get his other last brother, his full blood brother, Benjamin. And when they return and Joseph sees Benjamin, we read on in the story, chapter 43, it says, "Then Joseph looked at his brother Benjamin, the son of his own mother. 'Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?' Joseph asked. 'May God be gracious to you, my son.' And then Joseph hurried from the room because he was overcome with emotion for his brother. He went into his private room where he broke down and wept." Now Joseph seems to be heading in the right direction. He even treats them to a huge banquet, but he's still not ready to fully disclose his identity and play and reveal the truth here. So he plays one more trick on his brothers, and he sends them back to get their father with lots of food, and he plants a silver cup in Benjamin's bag to make him look like a thief. And he demands that Benjamin stay with Joseph as a slave when he's caught. Judah, one of the older brothers, steps up and pleads with Joseph. And he said to Joseph, if we come back to our father Jacob without our youngest and his new favorite son Benjamin, it will kill him with grief. And Judah's words are too much for Joseph. Let's go on and read a rather long passage here from Genesis chapter 45 that helps to finish the story. It says, Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. And then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourself for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will neither be plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. He's the one who has made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of this entire palace, and the governor of all Egypt. Now, hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. So come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, your household and all your family's animals would starve. Then Joseph added, look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I am really Joseph. Go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything you've seen, and then bring my father here quickly. Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of the brothers and wept over them, and after that they began talking freely with him. Brings us to our 5th observation. When life deals deep hurts, real healing only comes through honesty and a change of heart. This is the only way to real healing. It's what Christ came to bring. It's called forgiveness, and it's not a feeling. Forgiveness does not mean I will automatically and instantaneously reestablish an intimate fellowship. It doesn't mean that the relationship will suddenly be perfect. After all, it was never perfect before. And it doesn't mean that we keep allowing people to hurt us. We need to take safety measures, establish boundaries. Forgiveness is hard. And forgiveness is impossible on our own. You can't order someone to forgive. Why is that? Well, forgiveness is not our natural default. Revenge is much more natural. Sometimes the wounds are so deep that the emotions are so raw. I believe forgiveness is a God thing. And when we don't forgive, we are actually the ones who are the losers. It's a horrible thing living in bitterness. In one of Jesus' most graphic parables, he tells about this man who was forgiven millions and millions and millions of dollars. It was almost like the national debt that he owed this king. And this same man, the one who was forgiven, turns and goes after someone else who owes him $5 and demands him that he pay it back. Jesus tells us this story to illustrate how absurd it is not to forgive someone. And so that we could remember what God did to offer to you and to me, his forgiveness. He sent his only son into the world to pay the penalty we all deserve to pay, and offers us forgiveness as a part of his plan for all of creation. None of us are perfect. We all need forgiveness, and God is really good at changing hearts, even yours and mine. Leads us to one of the last observations. Leave the justice to Jesus. Leave the justice to God. We cannot truly understand the story of Joseph without really seeing the big picture of what's going on here. How God had chosen Joseph to be this key player in history. And remember, history is his story. It's God's story. It's the story of the world. Joseph discovered something that we need to absorb in each of our hearts, that God has this incredible view from an overall above picture. And even in the dark times of those 13 years, from age 17 to 30, we remember the whole story, how God was working. And it was becoming crystal clear to Joseph that God's plan is always to have his person in his place for his purposes. And so that's what Joseph finally says to his brother. Genesis 50, verses 19 and 20, he says these words. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." It was part of God's plan so that on the day of the famine, the right person would be in the right place to accomplish the purposes of God. The immediate purpose was to feed the nations for 7 years. But you know what? There was even a greater purpose. The greater purpose was that the sons of Jacob could be in line for the birth of Jesus Christ, for the salvation of the whole world. That's why, honestly, we're here today. That's why we can worship Jesus today. That's why, because Jesus died on the cross for our sin. And now we celebrate that he rose from the dead so that we can be forgiven. So now we can have a relationship with Jesus, and we can know his love forever. We can be part of a community that is here to bring his love and his justice and his peace to everyone. It was important that Joseph be on the throne of Egypt that day. And God says, "I was with you all the time, Joseph." Remember those words? The Lord was with Joseph. He says, "I have good, hope-filled plans for your life." And if the Lord knows those plans, even though I might like to know them, and I might like to kick and scream and try to be in control and complain and question at times, ultimately, if the Lord knows those plans, that's good enough for me. I don't have to know the future. I just want to see him. I just want to see Jesus. I want to trust Jesus every day. I want to trust my life into his capable hands, and I know you do too. You see, you and I have been called to be God's people, and God has us alive at this time in this unprecedented season. And we're here to encourage each other so that we can invite others into a community of faith. And we're here so that they can maybe make a first connection with Jesus. Use this time. Use your abilities. Use your connections in God's way to reach the world, one person at a time. Let's be quiet for just a couple seconds, and then I'm going to choose to close. Thank you, Jesus, that we can trust you. Give us the grace to let go of any bitterness that we might be holding on to in our lives right now, and leave the justice to you. We trust you for everything in our lives. We thank you for this incredible account from the life of Joseph. We thank you for his example, for his trust, and we join with Joseph in trusting you with everything, and knowing that what seems to be not good in this life, God, we know that you can take it and you can make it something that is even glorifying to you. All this because of what Jesus did for us. And in his name we pray these things. Amen.